From the clinic to the cutting edge, real talk, no BS pledge. Modern medicine, here we go. The science you need to know.
This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only. It is not medical advice, and it does not create a doctor-patient relationship. Always talk to your own physician before making any changes to your health, medications, or treatment plan.
Every question, every claim, we break it down, we keep it sane. From the labs to the front line. Modern medicine, every time. Modern medicine, let's begin.
Welcome, everybody, to the very first Modern Medicine podcast. I'm so excited to be here. I am here with two of my favorite people. My long-term partner, Dr. Shively, who has sat next to me for 18 years. Did you know, Dr. Shively, that today actually represents 18 years together?
Wow, 18 years?
August 1st, 2008.
Doesn't seem more than 25 to me, so.
There's very few people that I have sat next to. Actually, I haven't sat next to somebody 18 years ever. And what a wonderful mentor, family doctor who also is well trained in many things, including geriatrics. Also have here one of my favorite people and partner, the very talented Dr. Victor Ferris, who's also family medicine trained. He has a sports medicine training as well, and a great addition to PrimeCare. We want to try something new today where we're going to start, talking a little bit more than what we can do inside the room. And we're offering a podcast to our patients and any of their friends to kind of talk about things that maybe we just didn't have always as much time in the room to do. So today we're going to pick a pretty broad topic. And the topic that we want to talk about today is apolipoproteins, statins, and myths. The cholesterol story your panel may not tell you. So, before we start, we always have those stories where people that say, well, I know this guy that had a perfect cholesterol, and even with doing all the right things, they still had a heart attack. And so I guess, the first question I'll put to the group is, how do you answer this? And maybe more broadly, where does cholesterol fit in within the risk factors of heart disease? And is cholesterol everything? What do you guys think about that?
So cholesterol is not the whole story for sure. There's a lot more involved in it than just the cholesterol, but cholesterol is a big factor in your risk for premature vascular disease that includes not just the coronary artery disease, but all the other vascular diseases, including peripheral vascular disease and the cerebral vascular disease, strokes, etc. Other factors that are important include whether or not you have high sugar levels, diabetes, whether or not your blood pressure is well controlled, and your genetic factors, some of which are not truly just a cholesterol level, but things that we'll get into today, like an Lp(a), which can be genetically modified. So that, plus your overall vascular health, your metabolic health in terms of how active you are and how metabolically active you are, all that factors into whether or not a cholesterol level is, how significant that is in the overall scheme of things.
So you're saying it's multifactorial, Doc?
I think I would agree too.
Yeah.
I would agree. Going back to your original example, an individual that has a normal cholesterol and still possibly gets a cardiovascular event, ultimately, it is what we're trying to assess in the patient is their risk. And that's the bottom line, is what is somebody's risk? I mean, we as physicians can't necessarily predict the future and understand who's going to end up with what type of event, but ultimately what we're trying to do is assess a patient's risk for having one of those events and try to mitigate that as much as we can. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with our patients, and that has to do with what we do as far as prescriptions, trying to just lower somebody's risk so that they have minimal cardiovascular risk and ultimately help stave off some of those events.
Yeah, I would agree. I tend to kind of talk about modifiable versus non-modifiable risk, right? And so when you talk about modifiable, that's like making sure your cholesterol's low. That's not
Right.
smoking. That's making sure that your blood pressure is under control. The non-modifiable ones are like age and family history
Even genetics.
and genetics, right? And maybe one day we'll have like genetic cures for some of this stuff. I won't be the first one to volunteer for it, but right? But we got to look at what we can do, and cholesterol tends to be that one thing that has evidence that if you lower it, can help. And so, as we were preparing for this podcast, I was just thinking, before we get into like treatment and stuff, I always like to know why. And actually, Dr. Shively turned me on to this a while ago. He told me about a TED talk by Simon Sinek, about the why, right? How companies succeed when they talk about the why. So how do we know that LDL, or forget LDL, how do we know that cholesterol is correlated to heart disease, you guys? What kind of evidence over the years have we seen that kind of supports that?
And so we can know some things are true based on the body of evidence. And one of the things that's different today than it was back when I started in medicine 50 some years ago is in the beginning we had very limited data. We had a total cholesterol level and a triglyceride level. LDLs came after I finished medical school. And then now, more recently, the ability to break those cholesterol particles down into subfractions of LDL and HDL, that's all new. And as we've come on in medicine over the last couple of decades, we've got more and more data supporting the fact that certain types of lipids correlate directly with your risk for heart disease. And so things that we now believe to be true often were not even knowable back before 2020. So as the data's come on, it becomes more and more associated with, and then we come to believe that this is true because it fits the model fits. And so far we haven't come up with another better explanation for why this is so. So as we come on, the lipids are correlated with the higher your cholesterol level, the higher your LDL, the higher your a thing called an Apolipoprotein B, which is a marker for your lipid-containing particles. Those all correlate directly with your risk for coronary disease.
And I don't want to bore our audience members with stats, but that's one of the things too, if anybody wants more in-depth look at anything, please let us know. But when you look at some of the progression, like from even the 1930s when they looked at, people who had fat storage disorders and they saw that those people had heart attacks. This is like pathology and looking inside the artery itself. Then following that, you started getting into like Framingham studies where you had people that were watched over many, many years. And then retrospective studies that looked at 400,000 people showing that higher mortality existed with cholesterol. As men of science or physicians of science, what does, just for our audience, like what does a higher end mean to you guys? Like when you're looking at this data, how do you determine whether or not something is worth the risk of giving to your patient? And how do you look at the benefit risk for those things?
I think it stems down to just risk benefit analysis. Assessing the patient's risk and then looking at the actual therapy and determining whether or not that risk is going to benefit them or harm them in some way, or maybe not even harm them, but possibly not give them the ultimate benefit. I think that's the key, and I try to do that particularly with all my patients, not even just for cholesterol, but for anything. Just doing a risk analysis on the patient and to determine, is the risk of doing nothing more beneficial to the patient's outcome than to intervene and put them on a certain type of therapy that could potentially have side effects and whatnot. So that's how I approach the patients as far as whether or not they need something. So a risk analysis and determining whether or not somebody needs it is really the thing paramount to me.
Very good. And it's really interesting when you look, it's kind of cool having practiced for 18 years, like I said at the beginning of the lecture, and I won't date you, Dr. Shively, but even working more than that, we got to see some progression where we went from initially knowing that cholesterol exists in the arteries of people who have heart attacks to then understanding how that happens, where the LDL was found inside the arteries, to breaking things down from total cholesterol to LDL, and you had mentioned as a teaser ApoB. So now what's really cool is we're able to understand not just like large scale cholesterol issues, but what individual particles do and what that means to the body. You know, you guys know me by now, like I'm a little bit more careful to jump into things, but then once I see that they're working, I'm all on board. What's exciting about medicine is you can see that there's mechanism that something exists and it's causing an issue, but what you don't know is what will happen if you have fixed that issue, what else was needed for that. And that's where these studies come in, right? You know, when you start studying these medications, they need to go through rigorous trials to make sure that fixing one thing doesn't cause another thing. You know, do you guys have, let's move on to like some of the particles. Do you guys want to talk about how you guys are using some of these new biomarkers, cardiac markers in your practice, and what you're doing to use that to assess risk for your patients and prescribe treatment?
To the point that you're making, one of the things that's exciting is we now understand the mechanism by which lipid particles cause atherosclerotic vascular disease, and that really wasn't known up until fairly recently. So we thought, made sense to us, that the cholesterol in your diet was going to be a big factor in your cholesterol levels. Turns out, scientifically, that's not exactly true unless you're a bunny. Bunnies metabolize cholesterol totally different. But what makes a difference in our diet is the high saturated fat content. Cholesterol by itself isn't actually directly absorbed and doesn't directly affect somebody's cholesterol level. Every cell in your body makes the cholesterol that it needs, and the liver processes that and helps distribute it. But what we now understand is that how atherosclerosis, which is the cholesterol deposition inside blood vessels, how that works is that the small LDL particles are like little carriers of fat wrapped in a protein, and when they're small, like the LDL particles are, they can get embedded into the wall of the blood vessels. When that happens, it's as if the cell has a small picket fence in front of it to kind of keep the blood from getting inside the cell. And that picket fence gets chalked up full of these particles of LDL, which causes an inflammatory response. The body then brings on white cells and things called foam cells. That causes an inflammatory reaction, and more cholesterol builds up to try to protect that area. And the cell essentially takes down that picket fence and puts up a cinder block wall to protect that thing. So you get hardening, actually calcification in the blood vessels to protect the cell from further damage.
So yeah, that mechanism is pretty interesting, right? And then when you get that inflammation, sometimes platelets can go to try to heal it, and that's how you get heart attack or stroke. Well, so you guys have probably faced this before in your exam room. You know, doc, I don't eat saturated fats. My diet's perfect. You know, why is my cholesterol so high? So you mentioned you can get it from diet, but I don't know if a lot of people realize too that your liver makes cholesterol. And so if it makes too much cholesterol, that also can contribute to that genetic part we talked about before. And that's sometimes I've always found if you eat too much cholesterol or saturated fats, it doesn't matter how much medication you take, sometimes it's not going to lower your cholesterol. But if it's genetic, some of these therapies do help. I guess the other thing is, okay, well, doc, don't I need some LDL? Like, how low are you going to drive it? Like, what do you guys tell your patients when they ask you, like, how much cholesterol do I need?
I typically try to adhere more so to the guidelines, because those are the numbers that have been derived as a result of data and studies. 2026 came out with cholesterol guidelines, and I think the target for our LDL should be somewhere under 100. With a few risk factors, that target should be somewhere closer to 70. And then there's some data with the cardiologist that indicate that when your LDL gets closer to 50 or even 40, that there won't ever be a cardiovascular event. And so I think from my perspective, LDL cholesterol, we should try to get it as low as possible. The other cholesterols we try to raise, and we'd use things to try to protect people's cardiovascular system. So not all cholesterol is bad. We do look at HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol, the quote unquote good cholesterol, and ultimately we want that as high as possible, and that offers cardiovascular protection to individuals that may have a higher cholesterol or have lower risk factors. And so that's where I try to target my patients based on what the data shows and try to assess their risk and move from there.
You bring up great points. They say a baby's born with 40 LDL, right? And so some of the newer...
Or lower, like 20.
Yeah.
Or even in the teens, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so what are you seeing, Doc? Like, I know there's a lot of thought out there that, you can survive with 20 to 60 LDL and make all of the other components that are cholesterol-based and do pretty good. Because sometimes people will worry, like, well, what happens if my LDL goes too low? Is that going to affect my testosterone or estrogen?
So my current belief is that there's no such thing as too low an LDL, that the brain seems to function just fine, because it will make its own cholesterol levels. It doesn't need to have systemic cholesterol levels to function. So it'll make all the cholesterol that it needs as long as it's got the substrates. So I think it's probably the right time in this discussion to just talk about where HDL, LDL, and the subparticles all fit in. And one way that I tell people is that the HDL cholesterols, the so-called good cholesterol levels, are more like Amazon beach balls of fat. Now, you may not eat much saturated fat, but as long as you've got the substrate for it, fat's an important energy source for muscle cells and for cellular metabolism. And those Amazon beach balls are big, juicy, fluffy sources of energy for a muscle that's being activated. They get dropped off at the doorstep and they leave, and they never cause much trouble. In the stadium, when we bounce the beach balls around, nobody gets hurt, nobody has to go to the med tent. There are other particles that are smaller and denser, more like softballs, and if there's a lot of them, in physics we would call it a stochastic process, there's just a lot of random events, they will bang into the walls and increase the likelihood that the cells along the epithelium, the lining of the vascular cells, will have some damage, and we'll see that start to show up as an inflammatory marker. And then there are some people, about 18% of us, who have a very, very dense, hard LDL particle called an Lp(a) that is genetically, most of it, 90% of it is genetically determined. And those are, in my mind, not beach balls, not softballs, but bowling balls. They will cause damage. They will break down the walls. They will cause atherosclerotic vascular reactive changes for that. This good and bad cholesterol level is pretty dynamic, though, because the truth is that LDL particles can be coalesced together to form an HDL beach ball, and that's triggered by things like exercise as well as some dietary factors like deep sea fish. But you can, in fact, sort of modify the number of LDL particles with exercise and potentially with some of the medications that we use.
You bring up good points, and I think I want to just underscore, like, when you're talking about particle size, specifically this apolipoprotein B has been something that has really been popular in our clinic, at least, and now you're starting to see some of the guidelines and other stuff talk about ApoB. In ApoB, there's one ApoB protein that's kind of connected to every one of these particles that can make your blood vessels have, plaques, cholesterol plaques, right? And so when you look at ApoB, it's a better way to look at your bad cholesterol than the LDL alone. And so you're gonna start seeing people using treatments to try to drive down the ApoB. And just lowering LDL alone causes a down regulation of the ApoB. Personally, between us, I would want to, in our audience, I would want to wait a little bit until a drug comes out that drives ApoB, particularly just to make sure that cholesterol now, instead of going from the liver out, doesn't cause like too much cholesterol in the liver. We call that hepatic steatosis. So I think these are the things that you hope the study evaluates, and then a little bit of time out in the market. But there's a lot of promise in that arena. The apolipoprotein A, I don't focus that much on it, but it's actually, because it's like, in my mind, one of the harder things to control. But do you guys, when you see a high apolipoprotein A and you're looking at the ratio of that to apolipoprotein B, are you guys giving a little reassurance to patients? Or are you still trying to drive down that ApoB? Because ApoA, just for the audience, can be tied to HDL levels, which we traditionally called our good cholesterol.
So those of us in the Michigan area will know that there's Commerce Township, in which there's a Commerce Road, and there's a junction of Commerce and Commerce and Commerce. So the naming convention for these lipoproteins has got to be something people are laughing about, the original developer. So there's a apoprotein A1,
right,
which is the main protein involved in the HDL cholesterol levels. And this is a mechanism by which this protein can essentially absorb cholesterol from the arteries and carry it back as if it's a truck, carry it back to the liver for processing. So the A1 levels are correlated with the HDL, the so-called good cholesterol level. Then there's a lipoprotein little a, the small a, and that's the one that I talk to as if they're bowling balls. And unfortunately, they're very easily confused. So A1 to B ratio is one way in which we can sort of get an idea about your overall metabolic health.
I mean, could we rename it today?
Yeah, we could.
Could we call it like Uber for A?
Yeah.
Uber for A.
Uber for bad cholesterol. Uber for good cholesterol, Uber for bad cholesterol, and the bowling alley particle.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, yeah, you're right. And even medications, like oftentimes, the way they name them, but that's for another day. So what do you think, Vic?
I think ultimately we use all of these things, again, going back to my original point, we use all these things to assess patients' risk. And we typically have conversations with patients, about that risk. So how does all of this, from my perspective, translate into real world? We could talk about particle size, but a lot of times that stuff gets patients may not fully understand it like we do, just based on our training. So how does it translate into what my patient may see? I mean, from my perspective, and this is how I practice, this may be different, and this is why they call it the art of medicine. Every single one of us may do the same thing a little bit differently. And it's not right or wrong, it's just how we do it, and we're all trying to get to the same goal. For me, an individual that comes in that typically has an abnormal cholesterol profile, maybe their LDL is exceeding what we thought would be helpful for them, we tend to give them an opportunity to try to change some of the modifiable risk factors, adjusting their diet, maybe getting some more exercise to try to burn off some of that cholesterol. Like Dr. Shively had mentioned, the major source of energy from a muscle is fat, and that's because the body can extract more molecules of energy from one molecule of fat than it can from one molecule of sugar. And that's why, with muscles, they have this is my sports medicine background, but with muscles, they have such a high metabolic rate that they need that exorbitant amount of energy to continue to contract well. So ultimately, if an individual comes in and has an abnormal profile, we try to modify some of the risk factors to see whether or not we can improve those numbers. And ultimately, we know that improving those numbers would help improve their cardiovascular system. If they're unable to do so, and ultimately that happens with reevaluation of patients, then we start talking about medications. And then what I typically do is I like to, if somebody does have an abnormal LDL, I like to do the apolipoprotein testing afterwards. And that ultimately helps me assess, more so of their risk factors. Apolipoprotein from the studies that I've looked at has been shown to be one of the highest predictors of cardiovascular disease risk. And so if I tend to see that, then we start talking about other steps that we can take to try to assess somebody's cardiac status. So for me, if I get an apolipoprotein or apolipoprotein B, lipoprotein A, apolipoprotein little a, and then high sensitivity CRP, if I get all those and those are abnormal, I'll tend to send my patients for a stress test. And what I usually use is trying to use a stress test to assess somebody's ability to meet the metabolic demands that their cardiac muscle is requesting. And then that ultimately helps to determine whether or not there's plaque formation in the coronary vessels and whether or not we need to intervene early to prevent a cardiovascular event. And that's typically how I approach patients. I typically start off with cholesterol, try to change some modifiable risk factors, and then ultimately, if we're unsuccessful in doing so, check an apolipoprotein, and if that's abnormal, checking their risk for cardiovascular disease.
So it's interesting, you bring up a lot of good points, and I was looking at a graph recently where you look from 1960 till 2010, and it was like 700 out of 100,000 heart attacks happened in the 60s, and it went all the way down to like 200 out of 100,000 by like 2010, and that's probably multifactorial. But when you look at you're talking about prevention and assessment, right? So when you look at prevention and trying to get people to prevent heart disease, you're absolutely right. It's not one thing. It's cholesterol, it's exercise, it's releasing the peptides in the muscle that helps you with your fat catabolism. And what's really cool is these recent guidelines, which you also alluded to earlier, Vic, have really expanded the number of people that you can really start targeting cholesterol for, right? We used to look at it, once you had a problem, you'd start like a cholesterol. Once you have a risk factor, we'd start a cholesterol. Now 30 to 70-year-olds are within the range of where they recommend, and ultra low cholesterol levels, right? So then you talk about like a stress test. Well, we're looking to try to see, has the damage been done at that point?
Right.
Hopefully in the future you can address this early, and some of these things are not as necessary for everybody. But when I first started, it was just stress test, and now these things will get covered a little bit better over time. But you could actually look at the arteries, right, with the CTA FFR. It's it's a coronary CAT scan that looks at the flow in the blood vessels. So it's really a great time to be alive and a great time to be in medicine. Yeah,
medicine has come a significantly long way since I started and where it's started and where it's come to now. It's amazing. I mean, I'm happy to be alive and seeing all this.
To the point you're making, the risk for dying of cardiovascular disease has dropped substantially over the last couple of decades, and we now have the opportunity, I think, to identify risk factors much more in depth than we ever did before. It's as if the Titanic swam into the iceberg with little warning, and now we've got the ability with radar and GPS to see icebergs over the horizon and try to navigate around them at some length. The onus then is for us to be as appropriate in terms of our preventative services as possible without going necessarily overboard. Not everybody needs to have a CTA FFR, for example. But I think we're all in agreement that first steps ought to be to address the overall lifestyle factors. Are you, in fact, getting proper rest? Are you getting an adequate diet? Are you watching your saturated fats if that's a problem? Is your cholesterol under control? Is your sugar under control? Is your blood pressure under control? And having done all of that, then if we don't have cholesterol levels that are meeting standards, then the next step is to see whether, in fact, there's been any evidence of vascular damage that puts them at risk for heart attack. I do think that the stress test is usually, as Vic said, the next step in the algorithm to see what happens under a load. So if you take your car to the mechanic and he puts it on a machine and all the numbers are fine, you say, well, geez, that's fine, but when I go up a hill, my car sputters. So
Right.
I need to do a road test then. I need to take it
Right.
out on the road and see what actually happens. So
It's a good analogy.
the difficulty with the stress test is just flow dynamics. The engineer in me, the physics in me says you can have a restriction of about 90% before you start to actually have a restriction in flow. So you can have a substantial narrowing of a coronary artery and still have enough blood to get through there for all but what we call zone 4, zone 5 exercise levels, where your heart rate is to the point where you're sprinting.
Is that at rest, or is that?
So you can at rest, walking up the stairs, depending on how fast you mow the yard, that stuff you can get through just fine, and have a stress test where your heart rate gets up to, typically the number is said to be about your age subtracted from 220, and then 85% of that is about where they say that's enough. So I'm in my mid 70s. That means a heart rate of 125. I go much harder than that, and before I have any symptoms of shortness of breath, and yet you can have substantial coronary disease, is what I'm saying, even with a normal stress test. So
Right.
I think at that level, then we need to also take a look at what these other factors are to see whether we need to go any deeper.
Right, and so it's you taught me a long time ago, change in stamina can be the first sign that you need to look further, right?
So I'll underscore that. It seems to me, especially in women, a change. I like to joke, I didn't understand women when I was 17. I don't understand them any better today. They have major heart disease with no more symptoms than I'm short of breath when I go up the stairs. You know what? I can run a freaking marathon and I'm still short of breath up 5 flights of stairs. I'm
Right.
winded. So I have a very twitchy trigger finger for my gals that tell me that all of a sudden their stamina changed. If it's changed, I'm thinking, ooga.
And especially maybe if they're at the point where they no longer are making estrogen and their cardiac risk is starting to go up. I agree. I definitely have used that, but even with no change in stamina, to your point, sometimes you could have issues. A lot of people want these calcium scores, and I'm just going to say it. I'm not a huge fan of it because it doesn't tell me if the calcium's inside the blood vessel or outside the blood vessel.
Agreed.
And the only real evidence, if you look at what the research says with a positive calcium score, is to recommend a statin to a patient. So I don't need a CAT scan to tell you to go on a statin.
Calcium scores are running out of favor now. I mean, plus looking at a calcium score, it only tells you whether or not there's hard plaque. It doesn't tell you if there's soft plaque. And so I've had a number of my patients have asked for these types of studies. And we have a conversation about, whether or not it's needed. I tend to use it. I hate to use a kind of a cliche statement, but if it is such a great test, why don't the insurance companies, pay for it? And that's because the insurance companies have done their own set of research and looked at the data and determined that it's really not going to change anybody's outcome. It's not a superior test to some other forms of tests. And so ultimately, we have that conversation. If the patient, their situation entails needing one, then I think we can order one and just use it as another tool in our repertoire to try to assess somebody's risk and treatment strategy, but it's not something that I rely on wholeheartedly. No, absolutely not.
You guys, I'm enjoying this. Yeah.
To take the other side of that argument, a coronary calcium score that's positive will tell you that there's at least a wall problem.
Right.
And to the point you're making, Vic, it really doesn't tell you whether there's a flow problem or not.
Right.
So you can have substantial coronary disease. Personally, my coronary calcium score is 5,000.
Oh,
I have extensive coronary disease, but I don't have a flow problem per se. I can walk, I can run, I can exercise. So my vessels are open enough that I can get blood to where it needs to go. But if you have a positive coronary calcium score, then that tells me that there has been damage done. It's probably not reversible, even if you were to get your lipids and everything else under control over time. But it will, for the average patient, I think, put them on notice that they have atherosclerotic coronary vascular disease, and perhaps that gets them to be more interested, compliant, engaged, mindful of their overall process of taking care of the other modifiable factors, which it then just makes it just puts a underscore and emphasis on you have already coronary disease. It'll often show up much younger than the age of 50 when it starts to become more of a problem. But it will help them sort of stay on task for what they need to be doing to prevent a future heart attack.
Sure, and I'm a big fan of those alerts that you can use in life to kind of motivate you. You know, I always like somebody that's got a slightly elevated blood pressure or a slightly elevated LDL because, it's not critical, but maybe this is a thing that enacts change, right? I guess I'll just qualify my statement with the calcium score that I like the flow test better.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, it's also not approved by insurance, but it's just because it's expensive. And that's another reason, unfortunately, why insurances sometimes don't cover things. But to your point, if you had a situation where you were concerned about a patient and they were resistant to making some lifestyle change, and that was the small alert that got them to make changes, yes, then it's a useful tool.
I think that's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
I really, just to go back to it, that really what it boils down to is making modifiable changes. And I think the most important thing that we as Americans is that we do consume huge amounts of saturated fat. I mean, there's a reason that our life expectancy is so much less than other parts of the world. It's because our diet, and we have huge amounts of money that we spend on, food and medicine, and we still don't have those high numbers to say that we're a healthier population. And I think it partly has to do with, you could make the argument of, corporations or whatnot, but ultimately what it boils down to is that the consumer is not ingesting the appropriate quantities or the ratios of certain types of foods. We're eating more processed foods. We're eating more saturated fat. We're not exercising enough. And those things over time, if you do that over time, you will start to see it affect your body. And ultimately, cholesterol may be a reason that they, have their first problem. Could be blood pressure, could be sugar issues. These are all results of just a poor diet, poor lifestyle that really can be changed. And I mean, there are other parts of the world that people do have a better diet. The Mediterraneans, the Asians, they typically have better diets packed with different types of fats, lower saturated fats, more omega-3 fats. And those people have been shown to have healthier cardiovascular systems, have higher longevities, have higher life expectancies. I mean, the average age of a Mediterranean is 87.1 years. Average age of 87.1 years. The next highest average age are the Japanese at 85 years. Average age of an American is 76.
You think we're more sedentary?
I think it's a multifactorial problem. I think we're more sedentary. I mean, okay, you go to Europe, okay? And I studied in Europe. I did my third year of medical school in London, so I understand. You go to Europe, you're at home and you want to go to the store. What do? You walk. You get up and you move. Okay? You want to go to somebody's house. You get up and you walk. You move around. You get more activity. Or here in the United States, you want to go to the store. What do? You get in your Mercedes and you go to the store. You're at work. In other parts of the world, you walk to work, you're outside, you're doing more activity when you are working. Here in the United States, we're more sedentary. We're at the computer all day. We're a service-oriented industry, and so there's not a lot of that manual or physical labor to get us moving as much. And so, yeah, I do think it's multifactorial. I think it's partly our sedentary lifestyle. I think it's an inability of us to consume the right proportions of fats and sugars and proteins. And I think we don't take enough supplements either. I mean, that gets a bad rap as well. People should be consuming more supplements on a daily basis. I always give my patients the analogy of your body. When you're talking about supplements, your body is a Myers, okay? And on the shelves are the vitamins and supplements that you have. If your body needs something, and these supplements and these vitamins are used as catalysts for chemical reactions to make a protein, to make an enzyme, to make something that your body needs. And if you don't have those vitamins and minerals on the shelf, your body won't have it to utilize. And ultimately that can start deteriorating your health as well. And so, and we see that frequently. We see that with people that are iron deficient. We see that people that are B12 and folate deficient, and they develop anemia. And these are the reasons that people end up having, problems in their health, is because we're not exercising, we're not taking the right proportions of foods, and we're not taking supplements.
So I don't disagree with you that there's a lot of things in our body that we need to function. It's amazing every day that we wake up with all the reactions that have to happen. It's really wonderful. You almost hope that you could get everything you need through diet, and we realize that sometimes the way the food in the farming is in America, it's not the same food source that we have.
It's hard with diet, Bob.
What I worry about, though, sometimes with supplements, and here's where I'm just a little bit cautious, is I think it was in the 90s where some senator approved supplements being approved without any regulations. I just think you have to be a little careful. Sometimes you don't really need, it's hard to always know, right? When we do a routine panel, if somebody had iron deficiency or B deficiency, you'd see some markers that would be a little bit abnormal.
It's a little bit more than that, Bob. I've looked into it. It's the trace mineral elements, the manganese, the copper, the selenium. I mean, who knows where they're getting that in their diet? And those three, particularly those three, are really responsible for boosting your immune system. Right. And so that's why I recommend at least just a daily multivitamin. Yeah, taking a daily, source, right? From a very good source. Yeah. I mean, I know we have an agreement with a company that tends to have really high quality vitamins, and so I would agree that it's just a simple multivitamin, and then you build off of that. Right. You can start taking more omega-3s if you need to. You can start using, ginkgo biloba or those other types of supplements if you so choose. If you have
the topic for a whole new hour.
I know, exactly.
I think so.
Moving into that diet and supplements and things like that. I do want to just briefly though we talked about saturated fats a couple of times in here, but I'm not sure our average listener understands what we mean by that. So it's not.
Well, where to get them from? Yeah,
where to get from. So the biggest sources of saturated fats are going to be coconut oil, which is 90% saturated fat. The palm and palm kernel oils, which are in the 80%. Butter, typical butter is around 60%, and then you get down into things like red meat, which is like 30%, something like that. So those are the big ones that in typical diets. And so not that those are all bad, but you should be just aware that those are the kinds of foods which can have an impact on your overall lipid levels. So,
especially if you're consuming them on a regular basis, if you're having a steak once in a while, I don't think that you're going to have too much of a problem.
Right.
You know, you guys, this is fun. I remember one time we went and saw an astronomer at the Fisher Theater, and we had good discussions that day. And I think about...
We're allowed to say who it is? No, we shouldn't say that.
This is a podcast. It's
He's great.
Meant to be, you know, open and honest. And so, you know, we look at the changes from total cholesterol to LDL to ApoB, ApoA, and now lipoprotein A, you know, PCSK9 inhibitors, which we haven't talked about, and all the little things that make up how this deposits, how it gets brought back to the liver. And I kind of think about like Hubble when it first started and how it was looking at space, and now you've got this James Webb telescope that can look through all the dust with infrared, and now it's finding like if there's oxygen on Earth-like planets that were found before.
That's fantastic.
It's finding asteroids that might hit us, so it's pretty cool, you know.
So to the point you're making, I think, you know, we are looking deeper and with more accuracy than we ever have before, and so I just want to bring up the question then. So if you do have a patient who has done all the things and yet they still have a positive coronary calcium score, and let's just say they've had what the state of the art, I believe, is a CTA, which is a coronary CT, a CAT scan of the coronary arteries with FFR, which stands for flow restricted analysis. So it's basically determining whether there's a partial or substantial blockage in those coronary arteries. Anything greater than 80% is said to be significant, and then there's a range between 75 and 80, which is intermediate, and below 70%, they're saying there's enough flow through there, then except in extreme circumstances, this person should have enough perfusion of their coronary. So if you have an LP little a, I want to talk about that situation, and I also want to talk about when it's appropriate to get cardiology involved in these cases. So what can a cardiologist add over and above what we're able to do at our level?
Oh, that's a that's a good segue into that, because not every problem requires a specialist, and us as primary physicians, I think we're adequately trained and have the know-how and the wherewithal to take care of a vast majority of these problems initially, and don't necessarily need to utilize every specialist right away. And I agree with you, Ted. This is part of what a primary physician should be doing. We should not be sending everybody out for every little thing that comes up. We're primary doctors. We're the ones that are on the front line. We're the ones that take care of you. We're the ones who identify problems, and we should be the ones to initiate therapy and manage things for the most part, until it gets to the point where we feel that a specialist may be necessary. So I would agree with you, Ted.
This is a critical role that we play in the healthcare system, in that our specialists, God love them, are trying to see 30 people in a day's time, and they're managing people with ejection fractions of 10 or 15%,
right.
5 medicines. They are like up to their ears in complicated cases that actually, you know, need their level of expertise. But at the primary care level, we as primary care physicians need to be taking the responsibility for identifying the problems, taking it to a level where we've gotten to the point where we feel like we need some extra help or guidance. And yeah, we're not doing as much as we could and should do if we're sending just somebody with a suspicion. We should be much closer to having identified a problem and taken it to our level and tried at our level to treat those kind of problems and get it under control before we actually say, okay, you now deserve to have a consultation with a cardiologist or a subspecialist, an electrophysiologist, for example.
I think part of the problem with long waits to see specialists is that they're taking care of things that could be done by primary care doctors. Mm-hmm. I think if we're able to work on prevention and risk factor modification, there's a lot of reasons why I need my cardiologist if somebody's got a rhythm problem, heart failure, something that needs to be a procedure that needs to be done. So I think we work really well in our village with keeping people out of trouble when we can and knowing when to recruit help when we need it. You guys, I want to move on. Instead of, I was going to talk about new meds, but I want to leave that for like a later part of this podcast. And I want to start talking about some of the myths that we see with statins and maybe like some of the concerns that people have. Because maybe I'll rewind a little bit and say, traditionally when somebody had a cholesterol problem, the first thought was to put them on a statin because it can lower, the production of cholesterol in the liver with the HMG coenzyme A, and it also can stabilize plaques. They've been around for a long time. The data supports it. But there's a percentage of the population that are statin phobic. And some of them are concerned about a theoretical muscle pain, and some of them might be concerned of memory fog. And some might actually think that it causes dementia. So what do you guys think about that? I know it's a loaded question.
Yeah, that is a loaded question.
You could pick apart one or dive into all of them.
I am in the school of thought that we utilize medications to treat a problem after we've tried to mitigate those modifiable risk factors. Statins are not my first choice. Neither is any cholesterol medication or any medication for that matter. I am just in the school of thought that I want to optimize somebody's health prior to, or at least attempt to modify somebody's health prior to me initiating any therapy on them, if possible. I mean, if somebody comes in with a huge blood pressure or a huge cholesterol, then obviously they're going to need a medication to help mitigate their risk regardless. But if somebody comes in with, slight elevated cholesterol, slight elevated blood pressure, I do try to modify their health and their life before I start a medication. When it comes to statins, I do think that they get a bad rap. I really do. I think the statins are there for a purpose. I think the most important part is that the general public is misinformed about the utility behind them. I think that there's more to a statin than just lowering your cholesterol. One thing that people typically don't understand about statins is that not only do you help lower your LDL cholesterol, which would ultimately help lower the ability to form new plaques, a new atherosclerosis or damage to your blood vessels, but any existing damage that's already been there, okay? You'd have a plaque. If you come and see us in the office and we identify that you've got an LDL of 180, okay? Well, that's an initial evaluation. How long has that LDL been elevated at 180? How much damage has already been done to the cardiovascular system of that patient? And so ultimately, what we try to utilize the statins to do is not only mitigate any further damage to their cardiovascular system, but any damage that's already been done. We try to improve that, and that's what a statin helps do. How does it do it? When you have a plaque in your artery, that plaque is laden with LDL cholesterol. And when it becomes laden with LDL cholesterol, it becomes highly unstable, meaning it can break off from the blood vessel, shoot downstream, and ultimately cause a dam effect, blocking off blood flow. Some of the statins will, not some of the statins, but what the statins will do is help remove or pull that LDL cholesterol out of that plaque, and thereby stabilizing that plaque, preventing it from shooting off. And so that's another reason that we utilize these medications. So I think that the medications themselves are great, but they should be used in a conversation with a patient to see what their end goal is and what our ability to help treat their problem is.
So you're a good doctor and you talk about exercise and diet first. That's great, right? So if anybody can try to reduce their cholesterol before they have to go on a medication, or it's triglycerides or blood pressure or sugar, right? We all want the same thing. But let's exclude all of that. This patient needs to be at that goal of 55. they need to be on statin, and they're concerned that's going to cause muscle ache. It's interesting because it is true that statins do more than just lower cholesterol. They also decrease certain proteins in the muscle that can affect mitochondrial changes. So they absolutely can cause muscle aches, but the data shows it's not permanent.
What's the percentage of that? I think you told me that.
You know, it's pretty low. I'd say it's like under 20%. I'd have to look up exactly. But in my experience, it's usually like about 3 in 100 people will say that they get a myalgia. And usually it goes, not usually, it goes away if you stop the medication. What I've found is if everything is made by the sun, but not all medications typically need to be given that way, you could still get your result, your LDL goal, and ApoB goals with like taking it every other day sometimes and reducing myalgias. Or there's actual evidence that coenzyme Q10 is part of the cascade that gets disrupted with statins, and a supplement like that or certain proteins can help you with it too. And so I only say that because number one, you know, if it's something that we've been talking about could protect you from having a heart attack, I'd hate a fear of something theoretical that's reversible, that could be prevented, keep you from using it. Now, the good news is if you absolutely didn't want a statin, we'll talk about it in a little bit, there's a whole shelf, if you will, at Myers, but not really Myers, of medications that we could prescribe in the future to target specific things that go above a statin and sideways to a statin. And so, Ted, what are your thoughts on that?
So I just want to clarify that. I'm just curious, Vic, do you think in your heart of hearts that if somebody was meticulous with their Mediterranean type diet and at least modestly aggressive physically, they were doing 3.5 hours of 7.2+ exercise a week, that they could get their lipids under control in what percent of cases, would you say?
Oh God. I think there's more to that, Ted. So
Okay.
there's more, you know, I think, and I've seen that with my patient population, that with proper diet and reducing saturated fats and increasing exercise, I think you can achieve a significant reduction of your bad cholesterol and increase your good cholesterol to help provide cardiovascular protection. I actually don't have a number, I'm sorry.
Just a guesstimate?
No, I'd probably say 30 to 35, maybe 40%. You can improve somebody's profile that way.
So ultimately, that should then at least decrease the amount of medication, the number of people who need to be treated, and the intensity of the treatment. I mean, going way back to the Forest study, pravastatin, Pravachol, the trade name, lowered cholesterol level, as did Mavacor, but it didn't have the effect that we were looking for in terms of prevention of cardiovascular disease, at least in part because as it was lowering cholesterol level, it was also thinning the fibrous cap over the cholesterol plaque. So if you think of a snowbank that's been out through most of the winter, the sun's beat on it, there's rain on it a couple of times, it's got a hard crust on it, you can walk on this crusty thing. At some point in the spring, when you stomp on that crusty snow, you'll break down through the crust and end up in that soft underbelly. And when cholesterol plaques rupture, as one of mine did last November, it can cause a thrombus right then and there. The value of atorvastatin when it came out was that it was better at absorbing the cholesterol from that soft underbelly than it was in reducing that fibrous cap. So that was the advantage that atorvastatin had over pravastatin, and the early one was Mevacor, and simvastatin was right in that same pattern. So then we could talk a little bit about the fact that atorvastatin and rosuvastatin, which is sold as Crestor, is more hydrophilic, so it should cause less in terms of mental type changes. I think the data, at least where I stand at the moment, is that the data on the mental fogginess is not clear. That there's a clear, there seems to be a lot of stuff about it causing mental fogginess or dementia, and I don't think there's any science there that I'm convinced of at the moment.
And I remember when this became a topic, some of the commentary networks were looking at a very loosely done study talking about memory loss on statins, which was quickly conflated to dementia. The science that I'm reading in in the people that are talking about it, people like Peter Attia, other things, comment that, if you do have some mental fogginess, discontinuation of statins usually brings back your cognition within 3 weeks. And one of the strong theories out there, your brain makes cholesterol, and we didn't really talk about ApoE, maybe on another topic we could do that, but the amount of cholesterol that you're making, your brain does use cholesterol and sugar. So if you have
85% of our brain is cholesterol.
Right, and so
It makes its own. It doesn't get it from your bloodstream.
Right.
Right, and so what Dr. Ted is saying, if some of these statins are better at being lipophilic or hydrophobic, and they're able to go past that blood-brain barrier, some of them may be acting on reducing cholesterol in the brain, which could cause slowness. So I found, like you, that Crestor is less likely to do that, and that's been one of my go-tos.
That's my go-to.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. I just think that the low side effect profile, the low dietary modifications that you get with it is really it's better tolerable that I've seen. Now, there's some utility behind Lipitor and other types of statins behind it. I know some of the cardiologists tend to like to use different types of statins, but for my practice, I try to choose one that's going to have the lowest detrimental impact on my patient's health and kind of monitor from there.
I like your approach, Dr. Vic, and I really like, if your patients first try diet and exercise, I've done that too. Hey, this is part of that multifactorial approach, right? You start there, and if it didn't work, they're still doing that, which is good, and you add a statin to it. But as far as the mental, the memory and cognition,
I don't see it. I'll be honest with you. Maybe that our patient populations are a little bit younger, but I've yet to see any of the mental fogginess. Nobody has ever come to me on a statin and said, doc, I'm just not feeling I'm having some brain fog. Now, they come with brain fog, but they're usually not even on a statin. I've yet to see that in my career of somebody coming in and complaining of that problem and attributing that to a statin medication.
Where I see it most is somebody who's afraid because of the fear of it, right?
Right.
And I think it's a bit of a selection bias.
Right.
And I'll echo that. People come in because they heard somebody
Right.
told them, they've read somewhere, they're afraid of a mental sluggishness that is hard to quantify, and like you said, it's as far as I know, never been reported to have been irreversible.
It's like that guy or that family member that said, my dad was great until he quit smoking and then everything fell apart. Well, maybe he quit smoking because he started feeling everything was falling apart.
Right.
And it's relation and not causation. So many people that are on statins because they have a lot of other things going on, right? They have a metabolic condition, maybe it's diabetes, maybe heart disease, all of which affect your blood vessels. So if you had waited too long and you started a statin later in life, they started a statin and all of a sudden they had memory loss. Well, maybe, right? We did talk about how that could happen, but also I think too, your blood vessels over many, many decades can have damage that are multifactorial. So, this whole approach of trying to target vascular health at an earlier age, I think is the right direction. I want to. Go ahead.
I do want to sort of, I don't know where you want to take us next, but I do want to just address the patient who, for a patient just yesterday, she's 32, her lipids are highly abnormal, cholesterol's in the 260s, or LDL's in the 160s, who has significant risk factors for coronary disease, but her overall situation is she has done what she can with her diet. I'm not going to get further with that, and her medical problems are such that she really can't exercise significantly. She's dug in. She does not want to take a statin for fear that it might cause some mental troubles or myalgia. So I guess we should just talk a little bit about what the alternatives are that are out there for that, and especially maybe how that relates to those folks who have the genetic condition called an elevated LP(a), which is about 18% of us, by the way.
You know, we all know in the room that, you know, the first thing that happens over time with our patients that helps with change is building that trust, and people tend to trust us even with that. There's a lot of information out there, so I like you try to be an advisor and not a dictator. So I think that if somebody's completely afraid of something, they're less likely to succeed, but maybe down the line they'd be open to it. So I might plant a seed that you know, we can try other things, but as long as you're open to conversations in the future, I'm happy. And why don't you show me what you're reading? Sometimes looking at what people are reading is important, and that might be a good topic next to see how do you evaluate, you know, what is good for you or not good for you in the age of AI, right? But there's lots of options, and this was going to be the next topic, so I'll just go into it. You know, I'm going to run through some medications that are on the market right now, and then see if that triggers a little conversation. So we all know about Zetia. This is something people can take orally, and it blocks cholesterol absorption in the gut. You know, it can lower cholesterol 18 to 25%, doesn't really stabilize plaques as far as like the research has shown, but it is showing that it can reduce cardiac events. Repatha is pretty cool. I know we've all gotten excited about it. When it first came out, it was very expensive, hard to get covered, but it works on the liver by blocking a PCSK9, which is a protein, not important to remember, that prevents LDL from being reabsorbed in the liver. So when you block that, you're pulling in more LDL. It's not really staying in the liver, it's kind of getting filtered through the bile duct, and it can lower your cholesterol by 55 to 60%. Focused on LDL, but as we talked about earlier, when you lower LDL, it also can reduce ApoB. So Praluent and LevQO are both those PCSK9 inhibitors in different ways, and they have different ways to inject it. But there's something I haven't written a lot of. I don't know if you guys have this, bempedoic acid, Nexletol. And this is like right above a statin. So the statins are working outside of the liver. This medication works on the liver. And this medication is posed to not have some of the side effects that statins have. So that might be the one I might introduce to your 32-year-old, even though higher up in the cascade, we know it's still going to have the same effect on LDL. Maybe that takes away some of the fear of the side effects from the statin. And then recently this month we had Lipfendra, which is a oral PCSK9 inhibitor, which is kind of exciting for somebody that doesn't want to take a shot. I'm going to wait a little bit on that one because when I took Repatha myself, every 2 weeks gave me a negative LDL because it's calculated. So I do it every 3 weeks. I don't know yet until I see it out a little bit if I'm going to jump onto that one. And then there's this Evkeeza, which I don't think you can really get very easily, which is stopping downstream or upstream LDL production. And it's like an every 4 week. You know, are you guys... it's nice that we have a palette to choose from for our patients. How are you guys deciding when to use some of these? And this is kind of like what you're asking, Dr. Ted, you know, how do you decide for a 32-year-old that doesn't want statin what to use next?
So in those cases where they're statin resistant, whether from something that's measurable because they've got elevated muscle enzymes or they're just dug in, the injectables have been the next step for me usually. So Repatha and its analogs are an alternative, work on an entirely different mechanism and work on that PCSK9 inhibitor. So that's probably next step for me. The oral version is brand new. I've not tried that on anybody, and like you, I tend to not be first off the mark on some of that stuff.
I think all of us are in the same boat on that one.
Typically, because as an oral medicine, you have to take a lot more of the chemical. The injectable stuff tends to bypass the oral digestion type stuff. So orally, you're going to take probably a dose every day and probably a lot more of it total milligrammage wise. But it may very well provide an alternative. So and just I think we should all be aware that things are changing very rapidly. May 25th, New England Journal, an IV infusion of a combination of enzymes knocked out the PCSK9 inhibitor of several hundred volunteers in a class 1 trial, and it left their cholesterol levels at the 180 mark for the length of the trial. Now that's just stage 1 trial. So there will be a 2 and a 3, but potentially if that makes it through all of those trials, by 2028 we may have an alternative therapy that will essentially be a modification of your genetics. Now, I'm not likely to be first on that either, because if I have my genetics changed and I can't change them back ever, I'm not sure I want to be there first. But if it in fact works, and if not this drug, there'll be another one. Potentially everybody at the age of 17 or 18 will get an infusion of this medicine, knock their cholesterol levels to 180, leave them there for life, and that should make a dramatic difference in the amount of cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, peripheral vascular disease, probably improve muscle, blood flow, and all of a sudden everybody's longevity jumps 25 years.
And then you can eat a steak every day.
Yeah, I'm thinking too, I mean, at the end of the day.
There's people eating steak every day regardless,
if you can
man.
afford it.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. If you can afford it.
Right. That's another topic, affordability. So, you mentioned like supplements, and I guess since we talked about medications, it's interesting. I have a patient whose cholesterol is perfect with red yeast, and some people that eat almonds, soy, garlic can lower triglycerides. So I'm not opposed to that. If you can like try something that doesn't hurt you and get some outcomes, we just got to be able to measure something. You want to try eating almonds? Let's just check and see what that does to your cholesterol.
Make sure you don't have gout.
Yeah, but I don't know if the viewers even know that red yeast extract actually is lovastatin. So if you thought you were avoiding the statin, and you're taking red yeast extract and not having muscle pain or brain fog, then you probably could handle the statin. But at that point, if you got your numbers, why should you change, right? All right, you guys. We've been talking for a while. This has been fun. Let's finish it with just some talk about Michigan, since we're here in Novi, one of the best cities in Michigan. Michigan is in the top third, upper middle tier for heart disease burden in the country.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and we have a pretty good workforce and pretty good middle class. I mean, people there's a lot of jobs here, but I guess I wonder the South tends to have better numbers when it comes to heart disease. There's probably some things we can infer, but what do you guys think some of that?
Could be more of a sedentary lifestyle possibility. It does get very cold here in the winter months, and I don't think people move as much as people do in the South. I think the diets of all Americans are pretty similar, whether you're in the North or South. I think that could be a potential correlation or correlating factor as to why we have more heart disease than somebody in the South. I don't think we move as much as people do.
So right, sometimes you don't need science to understand things that
Common sense.
Sometimes people try to study things that are common sense in order to adopt them, but we know that if exercise helps you, like you talked about before, Dr. Vic, with your cardiovascular disease, and we know that moving around and eating well can help, then why wouldn't we be able to infer that if you have a long winter and you're not moving, you wouldn't have a higher cholesterol, right? So then I guess for the viewers, I would just say there can be a mindfulness with this. If you know that you live in a state where you're not, there's more cars too, right? Maybe people aren't, there's not a culture of like walking and running as much. Can you find a way in the winter to go to a mall or, find a local gym or do things so that you don't stop
or use your treadmill?
Yeah, I have patients that golf through the summer and they're great, everything's great. And then they tell me in the winter that, things are going to get worse. Well, why do that every year? Like some of these patients that live from Michigan to Florida end up having better quality of life and they live longer, right? So can we do that and just think about how you could, in a colder state with less movement, plan for this winter?
So my grandfather was a RFD postman, rural federal delivery, horse and buggy in the old days. Lots of pictures in the family album of snow over the hubcaps, and
that's cool.
Only later on did he get a truck when he was well into his 40s. But
that's super cool.
He used to say that there's no such thing as inclement weather, but there sure as heck are people who don't know how to dress right.
Right.
And it's all about motivation, I think. Personally, I have access to a hat, and coat, and gloves, and I'm not afraid to use them. I don't like to be cold, but I figured out a way to avoid that. And I some of the more peaceful, joyous times in my life have been by myself in the middle of the winter when there's nobody around and it's just me and God in the snow. So I think it's a matter of just how motivated are you? What is the motivation? If you're talking about trying to keep as healthy as possible, as long as possible, then I think you can. People who want to find a way to move will. People who can find every excuse in the book will. And somehow we just have to make that rapport that you talked about. The people trust us. We have long-term relationships with them. We're probably better, more equipped, and in the position to get people to say, what's your why? Going back to what we talked about earlier, it was cynic. Why do this? Because it's important if you want to be able to play baseball with your grandkids.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to have somebody have to help you off the floor in your 80s, that's doable. Just don't go.
You know what? Maybe that's our third topic. We'll talk about where you want to be when you're 100 and how do we get you there. Ted, okay, so with that being said, I'm going to give a little teaser. I'm going to announce it right now. Our next podcast is going to be about discerning fake from real in the world of AI and how you can make sure that you're not being led by false information.
It's a great topic.
Amen.
Thank you
Great
guys
topic.
so much today. We got the first one done, guys.